dirt road in a gooseneck, saddle up with me. Dry land in God's country, crops far as I can see. The headlights on both ends of my heat day. This country life is for me. Ride with us, HPJ. Ride with us, HPJ.
Thank you all for joining us again this morning for our third day of sessions of Cattle U. Our presenters this morning will be Rebecca Kern of Ward Laboratories and Dale Strickler of Grain Cover Seed. You know, like so many of you joining us, High Plains Journal was a regular sight in our ranch's mailbox when I was growing up in the Kansas Flint Hills. I remember my dad taking out classified ads to sell our Angus bulls every year, and my siblings and I would read through the stacks of journals in the living room alongside the local newspapers. And I remember thinking to myself, someday I want to write stories about cattlemen. Well, you know, a lot has changed in 40 years of ag communications. We now reach you not only in those print classified ad pages, but also now online at hpjclassifieds.com. If you get the chance, check it out and let us know what you think. Our company is always thinking about how to help you, our readers, and our neighbors. So more than a decade ago, we started these educational U events. Last year was our first Cattle U. It was our attempt to bring education to all segments of the beef industry. Like all of you, we really wish that we could be conducting our Cattle U in person this year, but safety, it has to come first. And so with our very gracious and flexible speakers and sponsors, we have pivoted to this virtual platform. Now, before we get started, we want to invite you to stand where you are and as you are able to join us in welcoming Kansas State FFA officers, Vice President Abby Johnson, President Elizabeth Sturgis, and Treasurer Hattie Polson as they lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Well, thank you, ladies, for that stirring start to our day. High Plains Journal is a proud supporter of FFA and 4-H youth all across our coverage area. This last spring, we donated 25% of every subscription we sold during the month of April to FFA chapters of our subscribers' choosing. We were able to donate more than $23,500 from subscribers' generosity. And most importantly, we created opportunities for the next generation of agricultural entrepreneurs. Now then, for you folks that are joining us at Cattle U online for the first time, let me share some notes about how we're going to go ahead and proceed. First, we've already muted your video and microphones. To ask your questions, just click on the chat box below and type your questions in the pop-up box that appears to the side of your screen. All of our sessions are going to be recorded, and the recordings will be posted soon after we're done at cattleu.net. The schedule of sessions and speakers is posted there as well. Remember, if you miss a session live, you can always catch up with the recordings at your convenience later on. We want to thank our lead sponsor for this session today, Ward Laboratories. Joining us with a message from Ward and to introduce our first speaker is Ryan Dennert, Business Manager for Ward Labs Incorporated. Ryan, welcome, and the screen is yours, sir.
Good morning, everybody, and again, thank you so much to the High Plains Journal for the opportunity to partner in this event. We feel that there's so much value in these U events that we were very excited to have the opportunity to create a partnership here where we could help provide information and have our experts from Ward Laboratories give as much information as necessary to help producers all over the country make the decisions on their operations that can benefit them, their communities, and ultimately feed the world. So again, we're extremely excited to be a part of this and for the opportunities that we get to partner with the High Plains Journal, and we look forward to continuing that partnership into the future for as long as they'll have us. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our first speaker. She is easily one of the most dedicated committed people I know to their profession. She takes her job and her work very seriously. It's a customer first mindset to make sure that the data is always on point. Rebecca Kern got her start in animal nutrition, feeding dairy cattle in Minnesota as a part-time job in high school. From there, Rebecca pursued her bachelor's in animal and veterinary sciences and earned a master's in animal nutrition from the University of Wyoming. She collaborated with the United States Meat Animal Research Center for her master's thesis project studying rumen epithelial physiology and gene expression related to gain and intake phenotypes. She has been consulting professional animal scientist at Ward Laboratories, Inc. for the past 4 years. Currently, Kern serves on the board of the NIRS Forage and Feed Testing Consortium. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Rebecca Kern.
Okay, so as you all know, we went virtual, so I've tried to really cut this down a lot. So I may be brief on some parts, so don't be afraid at the end if there's something that I skimmed over that didn't quite hit with you to just ask. So today we're going to talk about representative forage sampling and using near-infrared spectroscopy to analyze your forages. This presentation has 4 parts. First is the importance of analyzing forages. So why do we need to do this to begin with? Secondly is all about taking a representative sample. What's the proper way to do that? Why does it matter that I do it properly? And then we're going to talk about the accuracy and reliability of near-infrared spectroscopy as a technology and a method that can really help you guys as beef producers on your operations. A lot of what we're going to talk about after that in the interpreting forage reports is going to come from a cow-calf operation, beef cow perspective, but a lot of the same concepts can be applied no matter what segment of the beef industry that you're in. So let's begin with starting to talk about the importance of forage analysis. Okay, so this table is one that I typically share in almost every presentation I give. So the first thing I want you to notice is, so we've got forage crops here in the very first column. And then our headers, we've got, this is crude protein, acid detergent fiber, neutral detergent fiber, and then of course, many of you beef producers, when I talk to you guys on the phone, you're really concerned about your TDN, your total digestible nutrients. The protein and the TDN are the 2 things that I get asked about the most. Hopefully by the end of this presentation, you will consider other aspects of your forage quality as well. So this table is showing all these different forages at different cutting, or at the same cutting stage, at the ideal cutting stage, the boot stage for grasses, the bud stage for legumes. So what I want you to notice is that these have all been cut at the correct time, but look at all this variation. When we're looking here at this grass, 10 to 18% crude protein range, the fibers, easily 10% difference in the range of fiber content of these forages. And of course, that's impacting the total digestible nutrients, which many of you cattlemen are going to be familiar that your cattle have a TDN requirement, and a range of 49 to 62, you may or may not be meeting that requirement. And so that variation is going to be why it's so crucial to be testing your forages. Now remember, this table, everything was cut at the proper time. However, you guys, when you're harvesting your forages, or even when you're sending your cattle out to graze, you're not necessarily having that be harvested at the ideal time, especially with grazing situations, or if weather's coming, storms are impending, things like that always affect our ability to harvest our forages at the ideal time. So what's happening as the maturity of the forage? How is that affecting things? So I'm briefly going to go over this, of course, because I think many of you are familiar. As plants mature, stem to leaf ratio changes, getting more stems, less leaves, which means more fiber, less crude protein as it matures, more crude protein as it's young. And so many of you are going to aim to be in this sweet spot when you're talking about harvesting forages like hay for yield, as well as getting the right TDN, less fibers, more protein, correct quality, all of those things. And of course, when we're grazing, we have to take this into account as well. just to hit on a few more things that may affect your forage quality and the nutrients that are really in that forage. And so these are all of the things, again, making those forages more variable. Fertilization, over-fertilization on some species can cause nitrate issues. That's something we need to be aware of, but proper fertilization using soil analysis can increase our protein content and decrease our fibers, which will ultimately mean a higher quality forage for our beef cattle. We've touched on leaf to stem ratio, weed content of the forage. Of course, if you're baling, that you're forced to eat those weeds, that's going to be a higher fiber, less protein part, probably accumulating nitrates. Weather patterns affect it, so I do want to talk for a minute about that. Last year we had really bad floods, and my producers here local in Nebraska, they had a terrible time with, you know, rained on forages. I just cut my forage, then we had floods. It got completely damaged, less protein, less soluble sugars, more fibers, a lower quality forage, and they really needed to be knowing what their forage was at and how to supplement that. On the flip side of that, the guys that are more in the panhandle of Nebraska, my Wyoming producers, Colorado producers, they saw more optimal precipitation when they are used to having such dry conditions, more similar to this year with the drought. And so they had less fibers, more protein. And this year I would expect and have seen that they're having, you know, back to the lower protein, higher fiber that they typically see with drought. So weather patterns can certainly play a huge role. Baling condition, I kind of hinted on the rained on hay, but something that's huge for you guys as we're going into fall and we're going to be starting to stockpile our winter forages is proper storage. And so if you go, you harvest your forage or you buy your forage, you test it, you're going to get a certain crude protein, some soluble sugars, your fibers. If you just throw that in the field and let it get snowed on, well, that's not going to be the same quality in February that it was when you tested it here in September. So that's something to consider, that it is going to be important that we properly store things to preserve them and to make sure that we're getting the right report to match up with what we're actually feeding. So if we're using our report from September, but we let it get rained on, snowed on, hail, wind, all of that, we're going to have a lower quality forage and we're going to need to supplement more. Okay, so I've kind of started talking a little bit about the economics of it. So again, I'm going to briefly go over this, but I do think this is an important point when it comes to feed and forage testing. This is a real life example. I had a producer come to me, analyzed he actually had 3 different forages. We chose to use the prairie hay and the oat hay, and then he was using dried distillers grain solubles as his supplement. He tested the dried distillers grain solubles with wet chemistry methods, and then we did run a near infrared analysis on the forages. So what we have here is his actual crude protein here in this first row, as determined by lab analysis for all 3 of these feeds that he's using to create his diet. So then we did some scenarios. So what if we have a producer who's, you know what, I'm just going to go off low end book values. I just want to make sure that they get the nutrients they need, but I'm not going to bother paying for a lab analysis. So that's the second row here. And then finally, the last row is this guy. He's really confident this is the best forage he's ever grown. He doesn't think that he's going to need to be supplementing, and so he's going to go off the high end of the book values that are out there. Okay, so I balanced these rations. I balanced for protein as well as TDN for a 1,200 pound lactating beef cow. So her protein requirement is about 8.8. And I used the University of Minnesota beef cow ration balancer, which I think is a great tool for you cow-calf guys. And I know many other land-grant universities have their own tools like this. No preference out there. This is just the one that I chose to use. Now let's look back at this table and look at how our balances turned out in reality and how that impacted us economically. So the first one, we used lab values. when we account for the TDN as well, we end up with a ration of 8.9% crude protein. So we're a little over on crude protein. We'd say, okay, their protein requirement is met, and we're paying $1.38 per day to feed each cow. Now, let's look at what happens on the low end when we use the low end book values. We balance our ration to be about 9 when we take into account the TDN book values as well. In reality, though, based on our lab analysis, we're actually feeding 12.4% crude protein. So we're overfeeding the crude protein by 3.6%. And you can bet that along with that increase in crude protein, there was an increase in TDN. So these animals are probably going to get fat. And many of you cattlemen know that's going to impact their ability to reproduce, to breed back, right? So we're going to have a negative impact on performance. Meanwhile, we're also overpaying per day by 10 cents for each animal. So when we say that we're feeding 100 cattle, we're losing $10 a day. So that's really going to add up fast. And that means that had we done a lab analysis, that's going to pay off quickly. Okay, so the last case scenario is feeding values on the high end range. So we think that these forages are just absolutely great. So in this scenario, we have no need to use the distiller's grain solubles. We balance our ration by mixing these two forages together to be 9% crude protein. But in reality, we're underfeeding on the crude protein because our ration actually has 6.9% crude protein. And so we're actually shorting them 1.9% crude protein, which is approximately 20% of their crude protein requirement when you consider that their requirement is 8.8. So that's huge. That's going to result in thin cattle. They're going to have a lesser ability to create antibodies. It's going to impact their immune system. You're going to see decreases in production, and you're going to see issues with their health. But this producer thinks he's coming out great because he's saving $17 per 100 head every day. So we've talked about the importance of forage testing. Forages are variable. Hopefully you just saw with the last slide that it will pay off. So the next thing is, let's talk about taking a representative sample. And so this is really important. So you need to take a representative sample that's going to represent your entire lot of hay or your entire field that you plan to graze. And then from that representative sample, we take a representative test portion to run in the lab. Again, we had to shorten this, so I will direct you, if you need more guidance on taking a representative sample, we have a video on our YouTube page. Hannah Dorn, our marketing director, she put that together. It's great. Check it out. Another resource I would direct you to is the nationalforagetesting.org. They have the principles of hay sampling, and that also is a great resource. So the first thing, I get questions almost every day. Is it okay if I just take a hand grab? You can, but you need to understand that you're only shortchanging yourself because you're not going to be getting an accurate result, especially if your forage is a legume. So your hand, the small particles of the leafy material, they slip through your fingers. You're going to see lower protein, you're going to see increased fiber, and so you're going to have less RFV, less RFQ, less TDN on your report. That does not accurately reflect what's in your forage. It's also important to use a hay probe, not only for that reason, but also because as we probe through the bale, it's stacked like this across the field. We're going to get more portions of that bale represented, whereas if we use just our hand or just a flake, we're not getting a whole representation and encompassing that. Okay, which brings me to my next point of how many subsamples, how many bales should I probe? And so this is actually stolen from that paper I just directed you towards, the recommended principles for proper hay sampling. And they chose to look at TDN. They tested 20 cores separately. And this really exemplifies why we need to take a good representation. What happens if I go out there and I say, you know, I'm just going to take 5 cores? Well, I could get this core, this core, this core, and these cores. And I have an overrepresentation, and I think my forage is great, but in reality, I didn't account for these portions of the field that were actually a lower quality. So we want an overall average representation so that when we're feeding and supplementing over the average of the whole course of feeding this forage out, we're meeting our animals' nutrient requirements. Okay, so now let's talk about sampling standing forages. So we want to apply the same principles for hay sampling as we do to sampling our pastures. So the hand grab method for pastures is fine, because what you want to do is you want to take your hand and use your fingers to imitate how a cow's tongue would be grabbing the forages. Okay, so we recommend, if you have a very uniform field, take a diagonal line, take 3 giant steps, look around. What are these animals consuming? If it looks like they're eating the tops of one forage, but they're nibbling the other one all the way down to the ground, sample those forages accordingly and try to take samples that are similar to what those animals consumed in that area of the field. If your field is less representative and it has more peaks and draws and valleys, take a zigzag pattern across that field and make sure that you're really getting forage samples from everywhere that they're grazing. And if there's an area that they're not really grazing, that's okay. Don't take those samples, because what you're trying to do is represent what their diet is on that field and determine, do I need to be supplementing for protein? Do I need to be supplementing for energy? And you might even take it a step further and find out, what kind of mineral supplementation do I need to be doing for each pasture? Okay, so that's the importance of forage sampling we've covered, taking a representative sample we've covered. So now when I send it to the lab, I get these calls daily. How do I mark my bag? Or what analysis do I want? And so this is where Board Laboratories is very active. We're members of the near-infrared feed and forage testing consortium. And so these next few slides are slides that I've put together along with that marketing and education committee. So hopefully I can share with you about how you can really get more information for similar or even less amount of money if by running an NIR analysis. And so there's many benefits to this analysis. What I usually hear from producers is, well, I only care about the crude protein and the TDN. So I want you to think about that moving through this second half of the presentation. Are those really the only constituents that you should be looking at, or should you be running a more comprehensive analysis to learn more about your forages? So first of all, how does NIR work? I just want to give you guys a little background. So it uses the same types of principles as any other wet chemistry analysis, where we're comparing a known to an unknown. And so when it comes to, like this example, we have starch, we have our known concentrations of starch, the standard curve. And so based on this standard curve, we can say that this unknown sample over here is probably about 150 micrograms per milliliter of starch. Near-infrared spectroscopy works very much the same way. We compare an unknown sample to samples in the database. The consortium database has thousands of samples. We contribute hundreds of samples each year, as do other labs, so that we really make sure that no matter where you're sending your sample from, it's going to be represented in the database. And if it's not, we're going to contribute it to that database. So we test the samples using light in the near-infrared region of the electromagnetic spectrum. So what happens is that light shines down on your sample. It interacts with these large molecule bonds, your fat, your proteins, your carbohydrates. They all have some sort of a little vibration, which causes the light that's reflected to reflect at a specific wavelength into the detector. Once it hits that detector, a spectra is essentially generated, and that's the output. And then it's these spectra that are compared to samples that have had reference wet chemistry methods ran on them. And so that is how they determine what the amounts of the constituents on your report are. So that's how they determine how much crude protein, how much ADF, how much NDF, all of these things. So what are the benefits to using this for you as a producer? Well, first of all, it's a decreased cost of analysis. To get all the constituents that you would get on a near-infrared consortium report, it would cost you closer to like $70 or maybe even more dollars, as opposed to at our lab, it's $18. Decreased sample handling and preparation. So this might not seem like a lot to you guys as producers, But what that means in the lab is that there's less technician touches. We're going to get to this in our next slide, but that basically means there's less room for human error, because while we are a lab and we pride ourselves on being very accurate and precise, at the end of the day, everyone's human, and every once in a while they're going to make an error. And so less places for human error means a more accurate, more repeatable and reproducible report for you. Furthermore, it's a non-destructive method, so we can add more tests on. NIR plus nitrates is a very common one, and it's environmentally friendly because we don't have the chemical inputs that we have for wet chemistry, and so we don't need to be worrying about disposing of those chemicals properly. So here you can see a real comparison. We have our constituents here on the left: moisture, protein, ADF, fat, ash, all of these, your digestibilities. To get this whole report, it would be 179 times that the technician had to handle the sample. And so how we made this is we just went through the protocols, and each step the technician had to take, we put it in here. And then we show the hours. So you can see it's a lot, as opposed to with the NIR, where we've done this on the library of samples. We've ran these constituents wet chemistry method one time, packing that cell, scanning it. 3 minutes later, we have results. So to those of you who still are questioning the accuracy and the precision of this method, the consortium has put together some data that came from 7 different labs. Of course, Board Labs was one that submitted data. And what happened is we all are required to participate in the National Forage Testing Association Proficiency Program. So over the course of 33 rounds of alfalfa, here we're looking at crude protein as predicted by NIR relative to the reference method average. So that's the wet chemistry reference method average. That's what this green line is. And then the upper limit and lower limit of acceptance. And you can see over 33 rounds across 7 labs, not a single crude protein was outside of the acceptable range. Now looking at NDF as another example, we only see 2 points that are outside of the acceptable limit over 7 labs and 33 rounds. The consortium member who actually put this data together is Dr. Uttam Saha of the University of Georgia, and his conclusion: when NIR calibration models are developed using good science and applied properly, and that's important. So you need to make sure that the labs are properly handling the sample to prepare it for the NIR scan, which means drying, grinding, all of that. NIR is as accurate as wet chemistry and forage nutritional analysis. So that's great news for you guys as producers. It means you can get an affordable analysis that's going to tell you more than just your crude protein and your ADF. So let's think about that moving forward as we talk about interpreting forage reports. And we're going to interpret these relative to a lactating beef cow. Okay, so the first one, and I know it's teeny tiny and I'm going to zoom in, but we've got a Sudex hybrid pearl millet, and you've got our NFTA certification up there. So let me remove that. I've just pulled right here. We've got this is the forage content, and then these are the requirements for the lactating beef cow. So first of all, let's take note that she does have a dry matter intake requirement. And that's something we're going to need to keep in mind as we evaluate our report and find out what are we learning from it. So first of all, yep, the total digestible nutrients, her energy requirements for that are met. Her net energy of maintenance requirements are met. Excellent, good. Okay, crude protein requirements are met. This 12.4, it's a little bit higher, so it's actually exceeding, but that's okay because these are very close, and extra protein is going to turn into energy for our beef cow, so it's not a big deal. But now let's look at our fibers. We have a huge red flag here because 60, an NDF over 60 at some point is going to start to affect her gut fill, which means she will not be able to meet her dry matter intake. And so while she is meeting the requirements on a percent of the feed she's consuming, she will not be meeting those requirements as a pounds per day. But let's look further. The NDF digestibility at 48 hours is at 64%. That's a large percent. And so that means that this 64.5, a large percent of that is digestible. And so most likely this forage is going to be meeting her requirements, but we do need to take note and be cautious and be constantly keeping an eye on her. And once we see her body condition starting to slip, we need to be giving her some supplement. But you can see that we had to use multiple constituents off of this report to determine what this forage is actually going to be like for her. So now let's do another example. This time we're going to use alfalfa. And the reason I'm choosing alfalfa as opposed to another sorghum, Sudan, or another grass forage is because we have different constituents on a legume that we need to be paying attention to. Okay, so once again, she's got that dry matter intake requirement. So let's take a look and see. So we're meeting her TDN, meeting her net energy of maintenance. Crude protein is being far exceeded. So that's a bit worrisome because we know that in the rumen, the gut microbes are going to take that protein and they're going to go bonkers with it, and they're going to have more than what they can actually use to reproduce. And they're going to start making their side products. So our fibers, looking at them, those are very low, which means it's a high quality forage, but it's probably not the best to combat this high protein that we've got. And again, our non-fiber carbohydrates are very, very, very high. And so because those are so high and we have all this excess crude protein, this forage is telling us, okay, if you're only feeding this, you're at risk of bloating. So we actually need to be mixing it with a high fiber forage and something that probably is even lower in protein than the previous forage. So we actually need to find us pretty much a straw almost to mix with this in order to actually meet her requirements properly, what she needs. Okay, so that's pretty much, that's all I had. So I think I can take questions now.
All right. Hey, thanks, Rebecca. I gotta say, you make forages and forage testing very interesting. And that's coming from somebody that took all the animal science classes. So thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, folks, before we get started with Q&A, remember, just tap on the chat icon at the bottom of the screen and type in your questions to the chat box and we will ask them here. Now is your time. Like I said earlier this morning, the kids went back to school. It's time for us to go back to school too and get some learning in. So first off, Rebecca, how many times do you talk to farmers and they are just completely baffled, or cattlemen are baffled about sampling and proper sampling methods? And you went over just a brief period, but what's the number one thing that you think, gee guys, if I had you all in the room together, this is the one thing I want you to know?
Okay, yeah, so if you're going to go to the effort to sample, you know, our president, Nick Ward, he's always garbage in, garbage out. And of course, he's referring to soil testing, but it's absolutely the same for feed testing. If you're going to go to the effort, don't just go get a hand grab. Come borrow our hay probe, go to your local extension, use a hay probe, take 20% of the bales. We want your reports to be accurate. If they're not accurate, then you're going off false information, a false sense of safety, essentially, kind of.
Okay. We've got a question here. Based on lab findings, are feed recommendations made to make adjustments for excesses or for deficiencies?
So it doesn't appear directly on our report. That's something that I work with producers, like I showed that example where I took those feeds and I helped him. Here's a starting point, and usually I'll give him a spreadsheet. And then a lot of, you know, other segments that aren't the cow-calf guys, they'll be working with their own nutritionists and a lot of nutritionists are, of course, using our reports to make those adjustments to determine what they need to do with those excesses and deficiencies. We were talking about macronutrients today. However, Ward Labs has been a huge supporter. South Dakota has a minerals program where they educate producers to take their samples, look at their mineral report, and then use that to choose their mineral that they want to use to supplement. So absolutely, it takes a little education, but we're here to support that.
Okay. We've got a lot of interest in using cover crops as a forage, and we're gonna hear from Dale Strickler later in this same session about that same topic, making your pastures work for you. With the rise in using cover crops as forages, is NIRS, is that even more critical than ever before, so we know exactly what are we feeding?
So it kind of depends on what your cover crops are. If you're one that really likes to mix it up, you're probably going to be better off going with a wet chemistry analysis. But if you're feeding, using wheat or triticale or some kind of small grain mixture as your cover crop, yeah, absolutely, NIR is going to be very accurate for you. Where obviously, if you're testing your cover crops, you need to be including those bulbs, the brassicas, the turnips. They are eating those bulbs, and that's not really a forage, but that's something that needs to be taken into consideration when you sample those fields. And so that's where I would actually recommend the wet chemistry methods for those. And then I would also caution, I just talked about the minerals. If you are using mixtures that include a lot of those brassicas, they're high in sulfur. So the minerals, it's going to be important for you to know what's in those minerals as well as in your water to really make some good educated supplements. And then I know a lot of guys are, they're low in magnesium, so I'm just going to feed a high mag mineral. That's not always the case. So I would say it's important to know what's in your cover crops. I think testing those is very important. And then a lot of those are also nitrate accumulators, unfortunately. So there's a lot of things to consider.
Got to be real careful. We can't just go willy-nilly. We got a question here. Are recommendations made on a long-term plan basis or for the season we're in? So I think the question is, what kind of timing can these overall recommendations be made on and trusted? Could you do less samples and make longer decisions, or does it really matter with the seasonality and the rain and the weather that we've gotten?
Yeah, so if it's a hay and you've baled it and you're storing it properly, your report's going to be good for like a year, maybe even longer if you're really good at storing hay. If you're talking pastures, absolutely they change. There's no question about that. That's kind of what that second slide or second graphic that I showed, how the maturity, you can see that the mineral content, it changes. As well as the crude protein and the fibers. And so depending on your season and what pasture you're on. So I know a lot of you guys that are really good stewards of your land aren't going to be grazing the same pasture at the same time of year every year. And so it's going to be important that you do resample every time you're moving them. And eventually you can kind of get to where you have a good idea. But again, that's going to depend again on the weather pattern. So you might get to a point where, okay, well, for the past 5 years, my reports have been the same. And then you get a year where it floods, or let's say you live in Wyoming and it snows in June. That's going to affect that. So.
Okay. Remember, folks, give us your questions over the chat box. Just click on the little button below and type those in there. Let's see. When we're talking about these tests in here, we have a lot of folks on that either put up their own hay or they're buying hay. So how can they make the most out of every dollar of hay that they are purchasing or the dollars that they are investing in putting it up? I think, for example, my dad, he would put up hay and he would always take the samples and everything. And he was going off of the crude protein and the TDN. But how can we use this extra NIRS to make that more marketable if we're selling, or to use it as a point of negotiation if we're buying?
Mm-hmm. So for buying and selling, I see a lot of guys, their questioning is the RFV and the RFQ. And the unfortunate thing that I see about that is I don't think that actually tells you a lot about how that forage is really going to interact with the animal, especially because what I see is a lot of misuse of RFV, which is really only meant to be applied to alfalfa forages. And unfortunately, I see it being applied everywhere. And I would definitely say dig into those constituents behind those equations. So RFV is based on ADF and NDF. So if you have a low RFV and you can see it's because my ADF and NDF are high, well then if you've got an NIR report, you can see that digestibility. You can see, okay, like the example, the NDF may be high, but it's also highly digestible. So this is going to work to feed my animal, and I might be able to get it at a discounted price because it has that low RFV, and usually they coincide, but a lot of times with the grass hay, you'll see a really low RFV, sometimes up to a 50-point difference on a grass, and then you'll have a higher RFQ. So you could have, like, I think I've seen like maybe a 90-point RFV and 125 RFQ, and that's going to work great for most beef cows. But if it's an alfalfa, that's obviously not going to be the case.
Okay. Well, hey folks, I don't see that we have any more. Oh, we do have one. What forage test accurately measures the value of a brown midrib sorghum versus a standard?
Yeah, so that's very important. So all of these new, well, they're not really new anymore, but the brown midrib, all these different varieties that the plant breeders have come up with, the consortium has done a really good job of trying to make sure that we have all of those kinds of samples in our database. So absolutely use NIR. And the cool thing about that is that you actually have the lignin on your report when you use NIR. And that test is quite costly if you choose to run it wet chemistry. And so, and it takes more time to get those results back. So I would say use to compare a regular to a brown midrib, but also realizing, and I think there's a lot of other people that I'm echoing that have said this, just because it's a brown midrib doesn't mean it was, the digestibilities and the lignin may still be just as high or sometimes higher than a regular variety, because if you're talking about buying, you didn't have control over how that forage was managed. If you're managing it, you can't, it's like a band-aid. You can't say, okay, I picked a variety that's going to be really digestible and low lignin. You have to still manage your forage properly.
Okay. Oh, we got another one. How hard are the reports to read and understand?
Okay, so I think, so here's a really good example. I've worked with some cattlemen in South Dakota that have not, they hadn't sampled before. So I went to the South Dakota cattleman, I give him, okay, I'm gonna try this. Well, he got his report back and he was like, I don't understand this at all, and didn't say anything. I saw him the next year, he said, well, I got my report, but I didn't know what to do with it. So I sat down with him, I went over the results. So if you decide to test and you want to try it out and you get it back and you're confused, just call and I'm here to walk you through the results. We have some other animal nutritionists on our staff, Carrie Putnam, that also can walk you through the results. And a lot of your extension agents, if you call them up, they will be willing to walk you through those results and help you understand as well. And I think once you sit down and do that, so that producer, once it clicks, there's something that clicks, oh, that's what that means. And I think that it's going to be important. Like I said, it takes a little self-educating, but I think you can get there and you will see that it will make, like I put that table together, it will make an economical impact if you can really use those numbers properly for your operation.
Okay, well, folks, it looks like we are out of questions. For Rebecca, thanks so much, Rebecca, for joining us. And we're going to go ahead and keep moving on. Thanks again, and tell everybody at Ward we appreciate them.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. We appreciate the opportunity.
As our next speaker, Dale Strickler, prepares to come on the screen, we want to take a brief moment to recognize some of our sponsors for our sessions this week.
At Ward Laboratories, we strive to provide quality analytical analysis of agricultural samples. Soil, plant, and fertilizer reports allow farmers to make informed decisions regarding field amendments. Soil health analysis provides producers with a tool to compare management practices. Water testing can ensure safety and quality for intended use. Feed reports provide nutrient information required to formulate mixed rations and devise supplementation strategies to meet animal requirements. Feed analysis can help producers improve the precision and profitability of their feeding program. Ward Labs provides more than just the numbers. We produce publications to assist with interpreting reports and answer frequently asked questions. We also give tours and hold events. Additionally, our professional staff consult with clients daily, providing information on amendment recommendations, agronomy, soil health, management practices, animal nutrition, and more. Our goal is to provide analytics and guidance resulting in producers making economically and environmentally responsible decisions.
Hi, my name is Logan Kennedy. I'm with Midcontinent Livestock Supplements. We wish that we could visit with each and every one of you in person, but unfortunately today we will be virtual. Our product line specializes in low moisture hard cooked supplements for large and small ruminant animals as well as equine. We have several options of cow-calf minerals, a great stress and stocker mineral, in addition to several top quality supplements for horses, sheep, and goats. We have 3 production plants to best serve your needs, one in Ellendale, North Dakota, one in Moberly, Missouri, and one in Valley Mills, Texas. We also have a readily available sales team with a wide variety of expertise that is able to address customers' needs on a daily basis. When feeding a weatherized MLS tub, there will be more consistent daily consumption, which helps in delivering value-added products such as fly control, Selmanax, and Zenpro Aveda 4 organic trace minerals. Value-added products are a great way to enhance your tub's performance and help your animals at the same time.
We're up here on the Grand River Lodge, located in the north central part of South Dakota. Awesome dual use property, fabulous cattle ranch, owner operated and rated for about 425, 450 pairs year round. My name is Jake Hyland. I'm an agent with Hayden Outdoors Real Estate Company, and we're up here on the banks of the Grand River located in northern South Dakota. Amazing hunting. As you can see here, it's got 6 miles of the Grand River, packed full of mule deer, whitetail, turkeys. The waterfowl in this place are awesome in the fall migration as they come down from North Dakota. It's a sportsman's paradise, but a heck of a cattle ranch at the same time. The Grand River Lodge is located about 40 minutes from Faith, South Dakota, and 30 minutes from Lemon, South Dakota. You can fly into Dickinson, North Dakota, Bismarck, North Dakota, or you're a short 3 hours from Rapid City, South Dakota. The Grand River Lodge sits on roughly 4,800 acres of a mix between cottonwood river bottoms, tillable ground, and large grass pastures. The river offers water rights to irrigate 640 acres of tillable ground up on top, and it lays as flat as a pancake. It's a pretty unique situation that you can find irrigated ground right in the center of South Dakota. Along with some awesome water rights, this property is being sold with its mineral rights. Great fishing in the river, walleye and pike run through about May through middle of July. Awesome catfishing throughout the summer. There's ample water throughout every corner of this property. Cyclone Creek flows down into the Grand River, and there's ponds and stock dams from corner to corner of this property. There's 22 tanks on this property that provide water for every pasture, not just the natural water sources with the river, creeks, and ponds, but he's got 6 wells supplying water throughout the whole ranch to 22 tanks. Smack dab in the middle of the ranch is about a 10 to 15 acre reservoir. Awesome right there in the middle, great source of water. Folks, this is one heck of a hunting property. The waterfowl hunting in western South Dakota is unreal. And there are ducks that line this Grand River from bank to bank, top to bottom. The geese that migrate through here in the fall, coming down right from Canada, we're right here on the North Dakota, South Dakota border. We'll stage up here, and there's a lot of ag. Shade Hill Reservoir is just a few miles to our west and offers an awesome roost spot for migrating birds to come in for the fall, roost, and then feed through the surrounding ag fields. The upland hunting is world class. Lots of grouse up on top of the ag fields. There's pheasants in every draw and ditch on the property. You'll even be lucky enough some days to kick up a couple coveys of Hungarian partridge. This ranch is unique in the fact that you have river bottom and bluffs, and what that does is provide ample habitat for both mule deer and whitetail, and it gives someone the opportunity to bow hunt it, rifle hunt it, muzzleloader hunt it. Tags are readily available for all 3 of those. He's set up perfect for someone that is a hardcore bow hunter that wants to get on the river bottom, run chair cameras, chase big whitetail, or do big spot and stalks on some of these monster mule deer. Having 6 miles of river bottom gives you some of the most ideal turkey habitat you can find in the country. And as you work your way around the ranch, you'll see as you get on these high spots, I think we did it a couple different times this week, you can see down in there and see, strutting turkeys. There's plenty of food source for them. There's food, cover, and water. Antelope hunting in this region of South Dakota is really good. The numbers are good, but also the trophy quality is really good. They take 2 or 3 trophy class antelope off here every year. I'm sitting inside the Grand River Lodge. It's a 5-bedroom lodge. Sleeps 10 people. Would make an awesome commercial hunting operation or just a perfect family or friend private destination and a retreat. Lots of good dry storage here. There's 2 big metal buildings with overhead doors. This ranch is owner rated for 450 pairs year-round. Tremendously cross-fenced. They rotate pastures about every 2 weeks, and what that does is let that grass rebound relatively quickly. The owner has taken a lot of pride and work and stewardship into coming up with a program to push those AMUs to their max. I think someone that is lucky enough to get this property next is being left a property that's been truly well maintained for not just the wildlife but also the cattle.
For your own private qualified showing, please call Jake Highland or John Harity today.
Well, hey, we want to thank Ward Labs again for sponsoring this session and all of our great sponsors for all of our virtual cattle use sessions. You can read more about all of their products and services in the digital program that will be emailed to all registrants. It's just our way of bringing the trade show to you. Well, now let's bring Dale Strickler back on for his presentation, Maximizing Pasture Production and Profit. Dale is the technical agronomist for Green Cover Seed and author of the books Managing Pasture and The Drought Resilient Farm. Strickler is a leader in the soil health movement and has presented on grazing topics at High Plains Journal's Soil Health U and Trade Show for many years now. He is an agronomist for Green Cover Seed and a leading cover crop, which is a leading cover crop specific seed company. Dale holds bachelor's and master's of science degrees in agronomy from Kansas State University, and he taught college for 15 years. So Dale, today's presentation should be just like coming back home, right?
Absolutely. So Thank you very much. I think I'll, in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and get cranked up here. Here we go. Okay. I'm hoping that by the end of this presentation, your mind looks like this, because I've just packed it full of information. And if you are in the cattle business right now, this is probably a pose you strike quite often. You're looking at a bill and you're worried and wondering how you're going to pay your bills. This is one of the toughest times that I can remember, maybe the toughest time since the mid 80s in agriculture and in the cattle business. And making a profit has become more and more difficult. And if you look at the profit equation, it's basically production times the price you receive minus your expenses. Now, if you look at this equation, when we're at the coffee shop or the bar or wherever you congregate with other farmers, ranchers, what do we complain about most? Almost always it's the price that we receive that gets the least complaint. Which of these can we control? Which of these can we control and which of them can we not control? Well, if you are in the commodity, if you're in the business selling commodity beef, you probably have the least control of the price you receive. So I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about production and expenses. Now, what do we spend money on in the cattle business? Usually we're spending money on inputs trying to increase production. So what we need to do, what we need to focus on is how can we increase production without adding expenses? How can we cut expenses without reducing production? So that's what this talk's going to focus on, is how you can increase production with low cost or no cost techniques. And we'll see how, see what we can do here. Okay, I'm going to start out by comparing ranching to corn production. Corn in 1900, we planted on 40 by 40 inch spacing so the horses could cultivate both ways, 6,900 seeds per acre, open pollinated varieties, no fertilizer, herbicide, insecticide, harvested by hand, and the national corn yield average in 1900 was 27 bushel an acre. In 1960, we moved to 30-inch rows because that's the width of a tractor tire. About 16,000 population. We used hybrid seed. We were pulling the planter with a tractor instead of a horse. We had some chemicals to control weeds, had chemicals to provide fertility, and chemicals to control insects. We've moved into the chemical age of farming. And we harvested with machinery, and the national average is 60 bushel an acre. So we doubled in that 60 years. Now, in 2020, we plant an insane amount of corn per acre. Satellite guided precision planting, auto steer tractor, you know, you got a cooler in there. It's more comfortable than most people's homes in that cab. And the air planter that they're pulling probably costs more than the homes that we have, most of us live in. And we have genetically engineered seed that controls insects through chemicals that plant produces itself, and it's resistant to multiple herbicides. So we can apply a big chemical cocktail to the fields to kill whatever we need to. And variable rate application and 175 bushel. So from 1900 to 2020, we have completely transformed corn production, and we've increased our per acre yields 6-fold. That's amazing. That's incredible. Now let's contrast that to Kansas cattle production. Okay, in 1900, we turned cows on native grass 1st of May, gave them 6 to 12 acres a pair, depending on where you are in the state. And when the grass is all gone, we go out and get them. We put them on corn stalks and leave them on corn stalks till they get hungry enough to start getting out. And then we start feeding them hay, keep them happy until the pastures green up again. We start the process over. 1960, turn cattle out, native grass May 1st, 6 to 12 acres per. It's gone. No corn stalks until they start getting out, and then feed them hay until grass greens up again, and do the same thing the next year. In 2020, turn cows out on native grass 1st of May, give them 6 to 12 acres per. When it's gone, you get the point here. We haven't changed anything. We're still managing our pastures the exact same way we did 120 years ago. We aren't doing anything really much different. We might put a little fertilizer out, we might spray some weeds, but that involves writing checks. And we're going to try to avoid writing checks to increase our production. So let's look at some different ways. Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. And we've been doing, in pasture management, we've been doing the same thing over and over again for 120 years. So let's look at biology. I want you to focus, not so much, we'll talk about some practices as we go here, but don't focus on the practices themselves. Focus on the principles that make the practice work in that environment. So if you're not in that exact same environment as the person doing the practice that I show here, focus on the principles. Why does this practice work for that person? And see if you can adapt it to them. These are the things, these are the inputs that make plants grow. Sunlight, water, minerals, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. Oxygen mainly to the root system, carbon dioxide to the leaves for photosynthesis. Which of these can we control? If I were to have a quiz, multiple choice quiz, choose the factors that you can control, most people would look at this and say, well, the only one of those I can control is soil minerals. And you can do that by adding fertilizer. Actually, folks, you have control over all of these. All of these factors you have control of. And I'll show you how you have control of these. People say, well, I don't have control over when it rains or how much it rains. And no, you don't. But I'm going to show you an example from one of the, and every farmer you talk to, every rancher you talk to, oh, it's just so dry here. It just never rains here. It just, this is the toughest place on earth to ranch. Okay, guys, I'm going to show you a place that you got nothing on this place. This is Al Bayda in Saudi Arabia. These folks average 2 inches of rain per year, 2. And you know what their biggest problem is for producing livestock? Their main income is from sheep grazing. Their biggest problem is flooding. Seriously, 2 inches of rain a year, and their biggest problem is flooding, because when it rains, the rain lands on those rocks and comes rushing down, because as you can see, their soil is not a lot. Well, there is no soil there, basically. It's limited rain on no soil. What can you do here? You ask 999, you ask 1 million farmers what they would do in this situation, 999,999 would say move. These guys didn't have that option. So what did they do to increase their productivity? Well, what they did is they made these little rock dams here across these little temporary stream courses. See, these little temporary streams are basically the only places that grew any grass. That's where all the livestock were when the floods came, after they get their infrequent but intense rainfall. So they made these rock dams. You can see several of them across this little stream called a wadi. And these dams then had wings that extended out on the upland. So as water came down this little dam deflected the water off to the sides so that that water was moved onto the uplands. This little rock terrace here, they made these little rock terraces to disperse that water from the streams, divert it from the streams out onto the uplands. This rock terrace is the same elevation, or actually slightly downhill from one of those temporary dams upstream. And they did this to stop the runoff. This is 10 years later. 10 years later in the summer, 10 years later in the fall. Look at that grass. That's more grass than I see in probably an entire county in eastern Colorado sometimes in the fall on 2 inches of rainfall. 2 inches of rainfall, and they were able to do this, folks. And I show you this not because I expect anybody or advise anybody to go out and make little rock terraces across their pastures. So don't focus on the practice, focus on the principle. How were they able to increase their production by this much? Turn basically bare rock into productive pasture? It was by stopping the runoff of rainfall. When you stop that rainfall from running off, you can accomplish some tremendous things. And you don't need to go out and make rock terraces to do that. In fact, the easiest way to do it is simply with your grazing management. Look at this Nebraska study. Compared the runoff of different, you can see the runoff down here, the runoff with different levels of ground cover on the pasture. How do you create ground cover on the pasture? Basically, it's easy. Don't eat so dang much of the pasture at any one time. And we'll hammer on that over and over again. But if you look at this, the pasture in excellent conditions, of that 3-inch rainfall, 2.7 inches went into the soil. On the poor pasture, only 9/10 of an inch went into the soil. Will 1.8 inches of moisture make a difference in your pasture production? Absolutely, absolutely. And if you look at this, I mean, this is common sense, right? Everybody knows this. So why doesn't everybody do it? Now, this is a picture I took out in extreme northwest Kansas. You can probably see Colorado if you look far enough to the west there. This is in 2012, driest year in history out there, 7 inches of rainfall. Was there enough rain to grow grass that year? Sure there was. Look at this, 7 inches of rainfall, and look at this grass in the ditch, but look at this pasture over here. Look at this pasture. There's a close-up. What percent ground cover is this? Is it 95%? Or is it closer to 50%? When it rains, how much water is going to soak in this soil? How much is going to run off? I think after looking at the data that we showed earlier, if there's any slope at all of this, a lot of that rainfall is going to just run off. It's not going to soak in because the ground is not protected. You're going to have a very hard crust at that surface, be impermeable to rainfall infiltration. The other thing that happens is when you graze too much of that, look what happens to your root growth here. When you remove 80, 90% of that vegetation, and I would say that previous photo had 80, 90% of that vegetation removed, you have no root growth. So not only do you get less moisture in the soil, your plants are less able to make use of the moisture. What happens to your productivity next year? And this is very simple. I'm not telling you anything you didn't know. Overgrazing is bad. But it takes more than realizing that overgrazing is bad. You have to have a plan B. What happens when the drought occurs? What do you do? How do you keep from overgrazing? How do you keep your pastures from looking like that one in the photo in a drought year? So it's nice to have options. Now, another means of increasing production, I mean, we talked about rainfall, soil moisture. Now we're going to talk a little bit about minerals. Now, what I have here, the plot on the left is 0 pounds of nitrogen. The next one is 100 pounds of nitrogen. The third one, as we go to the right, is 200 pounds of nitrogen, and the fourth one is 300 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Fertilizer makes grass grow. I bet you didn't know that before you came on here. In fact, we've documented this, and we all know this, that fertilizer makes plants grow. The problem with fertilizer is that you write a very big check every year for that fertilizer. Is there a different way? We know nitrogen fertilizer makes grass grow, but is there a different way to obtain that nitrogen than just going out and buying more fertilizer? And this is a picture of, to the right, you see the pale green there, that is orchard grass. And to the left of the photo over here is alfalfa. And I apologize for the poor quality of this photo. I took this with a cell phone several years ago, back when cell phones took very poor pictures. But look at the junction between those two plots where the alfalfa and the orchard grass overlap. Look at all that productivity. Look at how lush and green the orchard grass is compared to this pale, puny orchard grass over here. We can produce nitrogen by putting legumes in pastures. And the legumes don't actually make the nitrogen. It's the bacteria in all these little nodules on the roots that make the nitrogen. And that nitrogen contribution from legumes can be, I mean, really impressive. Take a look at this. Bermuda grass with alfalfa in it, this is some Georgia data, produced almost as much yield, I mean, more than 200 pounds in, almost as much as 400 pounds of nitrogen. What does 400 pounds of nitrogen cost you in the form of dry fertilizer spread on a pasture? And you're probably talking $150 to $200 an acre most of the time. And we can get that for free if we include legumes. So why don't more people include legumes in the pasture? Well, one reason is they're scared of bloat. That's something we can overcome with management. They're scared of the legumes not persisting, spending money on seed, and then the legumes don't last. The reason they don't last is because we aren't using proper grazing management to allow legumes to proliferate. And the third one is that we feel we need to spray for weeds. And when we spray for weeds, we are killing our legumes. So people find it just easier mentally to just keep buying fertilizer and keep buying chemicals to kill weeds. But we don't need to do that. And that's one of the things I want to stress is that if you use proper grazing management, you can eliminate both those inputs. Now, probably the most important thing you can do if you are managing pasture of any form, actually, if you're in agriculture, period, you have to realize that you are a used sunlight salesman. Ed Alexander, a friend of mine, came up with this used sunlight salesman tag, and I love it because once you realize that your job in agriculture, if you're a rancher, you're not, if you think of yourself as selling beef, then you will never progress as a pasture manager. You have to remember that your job is to harvest sunlight and water and capture as much sunlight and as much water as you can on your ranch and use your cattle as a means of turning sunlight and rainfall into money. Once you make that mental switch, life becomes easier. When you have the realization that every raindrop that runs off your place is wasted money, and every photon that strikes bare soil on your farm or ranch is a waste, the world becomes, boom, your mind just blows up and expands, and you'll see all kinds of opportunities. You'll see there is wasted economic opportunity on every single farm and ranch in the world. When you become a used sunlight salesman, you'll see all kinds of opportunity. Now, here's an example. And the neat thing about it is most of the things that we can do to capture sunlight and more water don't really cost us additional money. There's some research as an example, North Platte, Nebraska, University of Nebraska had this data here. And look at this. All this is irrigated cool season grasses. And I want to focus on the smooth brome because that's a common one in Kansas. All they did is change the stubble height that they grazed down to. Look at this. 3-inch stubble height, 6,000 pounds per acre, 3 tons. When they grazed down to only a 6-inch stubble height, just didn't graze so much at one time, They doubled the yield. Double the yield. How much does it cost to make this change? Not one thin dime. You say, well, so why don't people leave the grass a little longer? Well, they're scared of wasting grass. Don't fear wasting grass. Fear wasting sunlight. Without that leaf area, you can't capture those photons that make the grass grow. And without the grass growing, you know, if you eat down to 3 inches, yeah, you can figure that you wasted 3 inches of grass. But what, in actuality, what you did is you wasted 6,000 pounds an acre that you could have produced if you'd left that grass intact. Make the change in your mind to becoming a used sunlight salesman. And if you look at this, if you're driving down the road and you see all this big tall grass in the pasture, you say, man, that guy's doing a good job pasture management. Is he? Or she? Whatever the case may be. Take a look at this. What percent defoliation was this grass clump right here? 0. Did this grass plant right here, or this one here, or this one here, contribute to your beef yield at all? None. What about this one here? What percent defoliation is this? 80, 90? How vigorous will this grass plant, or this plant, or this plant, or this plant be next year? So we've got very patchy grazing. From the road, it looks great. This is not good grazing management. You say, well, how do you make the cows just eat everything? I mean, from what I showed you, we'd want to eat every grass plant to 40%. Well, how do you make, sometimes the cows don't get the memo. How do you make the cows eat half of this plant and half of this plant instead of all of this plant and none of this one? Well, and you can see that when we've got, there's no difference, you know, that plant that was not grazed at all is no better off than the one that was grazed about 40, 50%. Ideally, we would eat somewhere in this range, 25 to 40% of each plant in that pasture. And it'll be just fine, and that'll help achieve maximum future. The way you accomplish that task is with rotational grazing. Now, I used to be very anti-rotational grazing. I thought it was a lot of work for no increase in production. And I have changed my tune because as I travel around and see people actually doing it is absolutely astounding. And the picture I have here, just to show you what can be accomplished, this is from South Africa. I went there in March. Got to travel around, see some really innovative pasture management. This looks kind of similar. This was at the end of their summer, which would be kind of analogous to where we are now at the end of our summer. Their March is our September. And you can see this pasture is patchy grazed. This is the good grasses here that have been eaten down to nothing. This stuff sticking up that's left is Aragrostis. Nothing wants to eat it. It's really unpalatable. Animals only eat it as starvation food. And this is typical of most pastures around the world. Continuous grazed, very patchy grazing, trending more and more towards unpalatable species. Now, a lot of our unpalatable species are broadleaves, and we go out and spray them. Their unpalatable species are mostly grasses, and you can't spray them out. So every year their pasture gets progressively worse. But the guy across the fence, who was one of my host families there, take a look at this. This is how he grazes. This guy right over here. He sits in a lawn chair and he moves this fence right here every 2 hours throughout the day and gives these cows fresh patch. And when they are done, they have eaten everything, not down to the ground, but every plant has been eaten. When you put cattle into a mob like this, their behavior changes. They start eating everything. It becomes almost a competition between the animals. And they're not starving. I mean, these cattle are full, they're content, they're productive. You change their psychology somehow. And I can't explain it. I've heard it like if you go to the Pizza Hut buffet, you're the only person there. You're going to walk around it 3 times trying to figure out what you're going to get. And then you'll walk away with your favorite thing. one thing. If, however, you're standing at the Pizza Hut buffet, you hear brakes screech, you look out the window, and there's a school bus carrying the high school football team, you're going to grab whatever you can and get to your table and start eating as fast as you can, because you see that competition. And for some reason, when you move this fence daily, or in this case, they're moving it 6 times a day, you change the behavior of those animals. They eat everything. I'll show you examples. And people say, oh, but you're going to ruin that pasture. This is, remember, this is what the neighbors look like. This is what my host family's pastures look like. Look at that, 4 foot tall. And this is getting ready to be grazed again. And what rotational grazing does is it has the same functions as steering wheel and brakes on a combine. Cow's a harvesting machine, combine's a harvesting machine. And without brakes and a steering wheel, you're just out there willy-nilly random. What rotational grazing does, rotational grazing accomplishes nothing. It is the person controlling the rotational grazing that accomplishes something. If you pay attention to how much residual you leave after each grazing and how much rest you give in between grazing, that's where the magic of rotational grazing occurs. It's really something where the skill of the person doing it makes all the difference in the world. And this guy, my host family here, his stocking rate, I mean, you look at that and say, man, he must be stocking really light. No, his stocking rate is 5 times that of his neighbors. 5 times as many cattle per acre as his neighbors. This is a really powerful tool, folks. I encourage you to really take a strong look. And like I said, one of the benefits of this is that they eat the weeds. People, my cows won't eat that weed. What's this weed? How many millions of dollars a year are spent spraying musk thistle in the High Plains Journal reading area? Millions? Billions? I don't know. It's a lot. We spray weeds, and almost all weeds will be eaten by cattle once you change their psychology. Here's an example. Does anybody recognize this weed right here that was defoliated? There's just enough leaves on there that you can identify it. That's ironweed. That's something that in continuous grazing, cattle don't touch. You say, well, yeah, if you starve them down to it, they'll eat the fence post. Look how much grass is left over. I mean, there's still a lot of grass out in this pasture. When you change that grazing pattern, you change the animal behavior. There is, and a lot of people spend a lot of money spraying ironweed out of pastures. If they eat it, do you need to spray it? Do you need to spray it if they're going to eat it? Absolutely not. One reason your productivity increases is because instead of spending money to spray for weeds, you're making money because your cattle are eating the weeds. Your weeds become another profit center instead of another check to write. Now, here's another opportunity wasted in agriculture. And you say, well, I don't see waste. I see a really productive wheat field. And this is on June 21st. What's unique about the day, June 21st? It's the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. The most sunlight we will get out of 365 and a quarter days out of the year is June 21st. How much photosynthesis is going on in this field? Zero, none. This is a waste of sunlight, complete waste of sunlight. And if you think about it, we'll talk about sunlight on pastures, but think about sunlight that falls on crop ground. How much of that gets wasted? I'll show you how much we do waste on our crop ground. And this is a picture just to give you a little perspective here. This is a map. This is the city of Wichita. Here's Emporia, Independence. Down here in the corner is Pittsburgh. And this little shot here, and I'll show you a close-up. Here's Iola, where I'm sitting right now. So this is the Neosho River Valley here. Here is the Verdigris, and here is the Fall River. So let's take a look at this Neosho here. This map is measuring the days of photosynthesis per year. If you know anything about southeast Kansas, you know our uplands are very poor soil. Our river bottoms are fantastic soil. Take a look at this. All this good Neosho River Valley soil, the photosynthesis level is about 90 days out of the year. 90 out of 365 and a quarter days out of the year. Our most productive soils are only working a quarter of the year. A quarter of the year. That's ridiculous. Why do we allow this? The other problem that happens, if you look at the Neosho River, and I'm about a mile from it right now, you go out there and it looks like chocolate milk. There's so much soil, so much sediment, so much fertilizer that washes down this river because it's not covered. So what do you do about solving both those problems? What if there was a way that we could stop that soil erosion, stop that fertilizer loss, stop the loss of that water, and use that sunlight to feed our cows in the wintertime? And that's what happened here. This is an aerial seeded. This was seeded by an airplane into standing corn. This is a mixture of ryegrass, turnips, and radish. This, as we were, took this the day they were combining, and the guy's son was putting out electric fence, and as soon as they got the corn off, the cattle went in, and they could use that for a fall graze. Look at how much protein was being added to those stalks, how much production, how much protein, how much soil protection was being provided by that. Now, another waste of sunlight, if you take a look at this, as a rancher, you say, oh, look at all that pretty grass out there. Now, some ranchers say, oh man, look at all that grass they wasted. You know, I don't see bare dirt. They wasted a bunch of grass. No, this is how a pasture should look if you want to maximize productivity on it. But on that grass, maximize productivity on that grass. But when I look at this, I see there is no photosynthesis going on. The guy in Australia named Colin Seiss saw his warm season grass pastures and thought the same thing. Why is there no photosynthesis going on out in my warm season grass in the winter? That's an opportunity. We're wasting sunlight. So he went to drilling cool season annuals, in this case, oats, into his warm season grass pasture. So he can have 2 seasons of grazing instead of 1 on that pasture. Use that sunlight. And then you think, oh, but you know, that's working your soil too hard. No, you're feeding your soil in this case. And if you look at profiles of the soil where he is doing this versus the neighbors, his organic matter content has roughly doubled in the time that he has started doing this practice. The lifeblood of soil is root exudates. When you add that cool season to that warm season, you get more root exudates. It means you feed more microbes, which means you make your soil better. You make your soil better, more productive. And we can do the same thing here. And this is sweet clover, yellow blossom sweet clover, seeded in native rangeland. You can see this is in the month of November. See that brown grass in the background? Look at all this green. No photosynthesis on the grass itself, but look at all this photosynthesis and nitrogen. Not only is this producing feed for fall grazing, and it'll produce feed for spring grazing as well, before the grass ever greens up, it's producing nitrogen. And we all know what nitrogen does to grass growth. Now, another way of extending your period of photosynthesis, like I said, is with cool season grasses, warm season grass, relay cropping. And this is fescue growing in a clump of Bermuda grass. See, the fescue is green. I took this down at Pratt, and the Bermuda grass around it has not greened up yet. So there are advantages to cool season grasses, advantages to warm season grasses. Now, one of the disadvantages of cool season grasses is that they really photosynthesize very poorly in the heat of summer. Took this photo. This was taken in September after After this brome, this was a hay field. After that brome was cut off late June, to the time this picture was taken, they'd had 16 inches of rain. That's quite a little bit of rain for summer in Kansas. This is about as good as it gets. And that cool season grass only grew ankle high, maybe boot top high if you stretch it. Cool season grasses don't efficiently use summer sunlight. So what this land manager did is half that field. He wanted to prove this to his landlord that this actually worked. He drilled all these summer annuals in it. This is the same field, just the east half rather than the west half I showed you earlier. Look at all this productivity gained by putting summer annuals that photosynthesize very rapidly in summer into that cool season sod. This was pastured off in September, shortly after I was there. Turned it all into manure and urine. Manure and urine contain nitrogen that makes the grass grow. You say, well, gosh, you're killing out your brome. I said, no, this brome was actually growing better under that canopy because it kept it cooler. Cool season grasses will grow better at 80 degrees than they will at 100. Out on that previous pasture, when it was 100 degrees out there, it was 100 degrees in the brome. Here, with this canopy up above it, when it was 100 degrees up here, down here, it was 80 degrees. And the grass could grow better. Even though there's less sunlight, there's more favorable temperatures for the cool season grass. Essentially, it turns a July day into an October day. Less sunlight, but cooler temperatures. Now, we want to talk about cutting expenses. The top two expenses for the typical cow herd in Kansas: making hay and feeding hay. And the reason it's so expensive is because times have changed. Now, why do we think we have to do this for our cattle? Why cattle survived for the millions of years of their existence without us hauling them bales of hay. So how, and at one time we thought that when we mechanized everything, we were becoming more efficient. And people still think we're becoming more efficient. And I guess it depends on how you measure efficiency. Can one person run more cattle than what they could 50 years ago, 60 years ago? Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt. You know, mechanization allows us to expand. But if you're losing money on every single head, more head does not improve your situation. You need to make more money per head. And what has happened is if you look at how prices have changed over time, check this out. I've got a number of items here comparing 1973 price, excuse me, to their price today. If you compare a pound of live beef, we essentially doubled, 73 to now. Oh, that's good. But a pound of nitrogen fertilizer has gone up 6-fold. Big round baler 16-fold, and diesel fuel up about 20 times. What's unique about nitrogen fertilizer, big round baler, and gallon of diesel? Why did I include those in there? Because those are inputs involved in making hay. Those are inputs involved in making hay. You can see all the inputs involved in making hay have gone up dramatically, far, far faster than the price we receive for our commodity. So if you don't like the rules of the game, play a different game. Get rid of it. Now I'll show you why this is so important. If you look at this picture, this is one of my cows, and this was one of my calves. And this calf weaned off at 920 pounds. Boy, isn't that impressive? Boy, this guy's doing something great, right? Now, let me tell you the rest of the story. Here's the story on this calf. See, I had when I was still ranching, I had a May calving cow herd. And I bought supposedly open heifers, and 4 of them gave birth on January 1st. New Year's Day, 4 little black dots out in the snow. Well, The rest of my cow herd was out on corn stalks, you know, roughing them through because they weren't going to calve for another 5 months. Corn stalks are just fine for them. But a lactating first calf heifer needs better feed. So those 4 heifers got alfalfa hay for that 4 months. And then when the rest of the animals went to grass, they joined them. So when this animal, those 4 averaged 920 pounds weaning weight, but they were a year old when they were weaned. Their herd mates were 8 months old when they were weaned, and they averaged 816. When I took them to sale, those 4 averaged $16 per head. $16 per head, more than the others. Can you buy 4 months of alfalfa hay for a cow for $16? If you can, let me know. Send me a message. I'd like to know where to buy that hay. You can't. And it struck me, said, oh my gosh, this is how most people raise cattle in this state. They calve in the dead of winter. You're putting your most critical operation and your most expensive time to feed, your need for the highest quality forage at a time when it's hardest to supply quality feed in good conditions in the dead of winter. And it's ridiculous. The best move I ever made in the cattle business was to change from February calving. February is not spring, folks. If you think you're a spring calver and you're calving in February, it's not spring. I moved to May calving. Best decision I ever made. Eliminated so many problems and so much expense, primarily hay expense, because I could now rough my cattle through on low quality grazing rather than expensive hay. And just an example here, if you look, high quality hay, $120 a ton, 6 cents a pound. You can go through these figures when you want to, but $270 a day just for the hay. I'm not including the cost to feed the hay. And people think that hay jumps up and flies over into that pen by itself. It doesn't. If you have machinery that you need to use to move that hay, that's expensive, sometimes more than the cost of the hay itself. $324 for a 4-month winter hay feeding period. You look at this now, low quality hay, which you can use if you're not lactating. You've got dry cow during that winter period, $60 a ton, 3 cents a pound, that's 90 cents a day. How much money are you saving? $1.80 a day. You've cut your winter feed cost by 2/3 just by having a non-lactating animal during the winter. You say, oh, but you're going to have dinky little calves. Dinky little calves are sell for just about as much as big calves, folks. There isn't much difference in sale price to that additional weight. Everybody seems to want 4 or 5 weight calves. But what I found when I went to later calving is my weaning weights actually went up. When I weaned at the same number of days of age, it's easier for me to produce quality feed in November and December using cover crops on crop ground. I could provide quality grazing, wean calve 2 months later, wean 2 months later. And my weaning weights went up because my calves weren't exposed to that winter stress. So how do we eliminate hay? Now, one way is to reduce your hay needs through shifting that calving period, but how do you just eliminate hay altogether? And my best year, I got down to feeding hay for 3 weeks. That was my best. Most of the time I was somewhere around a month to 6 weeks of feeding hay. Now you can graze corn stalks, and pretty much everybody knows you can graze corn stalks, but 99% of people really graze corn stalks incorrectly. And there's just one simple trick where you can double the number of days you can stay out on an acre of corn stalks. Double your productivity. Now it will take about a 10-minute a day investment of your time. And how does this work? Well, when you turn cattle out into unrestricted cornfield, give them the whole thing, the first thing they're going to eat is the corn grain. They're going to eat the grain. They're going to go 100% grain diet. What happens when you take an animal off of grass and transition them to a grain diet, the inside of the rumen, these are 3 pieces of rumen cut from harvested animals. And this is the lining. This is what a rumen's supposed to look like here. This, the middle one there, is an animal that got acidosis from having too much grain. When you turn cattle out on corn stalks or milo stalks and they get 100% grain diet that first day, this happens to the inside of the rumen. You basically cut their efficiency, the ability to digest that feed, in half. How do you prevent that? Well, it's really pretty simple. All you do is use polywire fencing. You got a little portable fence reel here, start at the water source, and every day you just leapfrog these fences away from the water. Give them 1 day's worth at a time. And it doesn't have to be 1 day. 1 day's most efficient, but it can be 3 days, can be a week, whatever. You're just trying to keep those animals from going into a state of acidosis. So instead of eating 30 pounds of grain on day one and getting acidosis, you ration it out so they get 5 pounds of grain and 25 pounds of stalks every day. Keep them that rumen in a neutral pH. And again, like the same picture I showed you earlier, you can also add things to that crop residue. You can add some cover crops that add some protein, add some green feed. You can not only increase the nutritional value of this to where instead of being maintenance feed, this is milking feed. You can leave that calf on the cow a couple more months and have the cow in actually better condition because she's grazing this, as well as add another 100 pounds on your calves. Another option for wintering cattle, this is a male sterile forage sorghum that was planted double crop after wheat harvest. This is an incredibly cheap way of wintering cattle. The quality is not super, it's low in protein, but the digestibility is good. Productivity is fantastic. I know people that are basically 1 acre of this will winter a cow for 4 months. And that's kind of out in central western Kansas. Typically normal growth, 1 cow for the winter on an acre of this. And it'll only cost less than $20 an acre is seed cost. Ridiculous cheap. Another opportunity we ignore is the potential for native rangeland to winter cattle. Now, this dry grass is very low in proteins, low in digestibility. Why don't we eat, but it's good enough for if you have a little protein supplement, it's good enough for a dry cow. So why don't we make more use of this? Well, number one, during the winter, our cows are lactating because we're calving in the middle of winter. If you're calving in the middle of winter, you can't make much use of this. And guys, this is free. This is free grazing. Number two reason is because we've basically grazed all this off by the time the season hits. It's gone. It's not there. We grazed 100% of our grass during the growing season. One of the biggest advantages of utilizing this for winter grazing with protein supplement is that it gives you an economic incentive to do what you're supposed to do anyhow to maximize production and graze less than half of it during the growing season. When you give value to this during the winter, all of a sudden you realize that you make more money by leaving half of it into the winter. Now you can still use 100% of it. You're not wasting that grass. You're just using it at a different time. And feed is more valuable in winter than it is in the summer because there's fewer options. If an acre of this replaces a ton of hay, then it's valuable. And one of the other resources, if you're in the eastern part of the state, this is a grass that everybody likes to cuss. This is fescue. Fescue is one of the worst summer grasses there is, but it's the single best winter grass there is. Unfortunately, most people try to use it that have fescue, use it as summer pasture, and it's all gone. This photo was taken on New Year's Eve. Look at how green that is. This is in January, or actually end of December, folks, and it's still green. And it's still 14, 15% protein and 70% digestibility at this stage. And the endophyte fungus, which is the big problem with fescue quality, the alkaloids, the toxins from that endophyte fungus diminish greatly over winter. This is actually better feed in February than it is in November. And, but the trick is, if you're going to stockpile this, reserve it for winter use, you need to have something else to graze in the summer and fall. And so that's one real benefit of, you know, either sparing your native range, saving it for fall, or your fescue and saving it for fall, or brome and saving it for fall or winter, is that you need to have something else to graze. And that's where planting cover crops in your cropland can come in. This was planted double crop after wheat, and this is in August, and that animal is living high. She's living large now. And at the same time, she's getting better nutrition than she does on late summer grass that's drying down. She's getting better nutrition. At the same time, those pastures are accumulating vigor and accumulating feed that you can use in the fall and winter. So if you look at all these different things we've talked about, the cover crops, the summer annuals, stockpiled fescue, all of these things can eliminate your biggest cost in the cow business. If you kick the hay habit, which is the title of a book by Jim Garish that I really strongly recommend. If you don't like reading, it is available on a CD that you can pop into the tractor while you're staying up all night baling hay. Kick the hay habit. If you kick the hay habit, you will do more good for improving your bottom line than any other measure you can take on your farm or ranch. So I guess instead of worrying about how you're going to pay the bills, figure out how to make your bills smaller. And the number one way of doing that is getting rid of the feed wagon. So if this stuff interests you, I do have a couple books out, Managing Pasture, Drought Resilient Farm. And here's my email if you have an interest in the books or in more information. I do work for Green Cover Seed. We've got a bunch of these videos on YouTube. Go to our website, greencoverseed.com. All kinds of stuff available there. So anyhow, I'm done, Jenny. So.
Well, hey, thank you, Dale. I tell you what, I learn so much every time that you take the stage at one of our meetings, and that's coming from a 5th generation cattleman. So thank you. Now it's time to hear from you all. So don't forget, you can type your questions by just clicking the chat button in the box below and typing those questions in. While we're waiting for those, Dale, let's talk about, later on today, we'll have Logan Hoffman on, and he's going to talk about really making sure that we fine tune our costs and really pick at that. And what you talked about today really directly links right into his accounting procedures and things. When you're working with young people, when you're working with cattlemen, what would you say would be the number one mistake that everybody makes, that we all make, that you wish, darn it, listen to me?
I think that the big thing is, you know, I talked about it repeatedly, but changing your mindset to become a harvester of sunlight and rainfall. And we you know, if you're a rancher, you look at a blade of grass and say, man, I need to get that blade of grass in my cow, otherwise it's wasted. No, the job of that blade of grass is to harvest sunlight. You harvest the surplus, but you look at every photon that strikes bare ground as a wasted sunlight that you can't ever. Sunlight is like time. You can't go back in time and you can't catch up. You know, always have a photosynthesizing leaf on every bit of land surface you manage, and an adequate leaf area. Probably the biggest mistake people make is they graze too much. Why do they graze too much at any given time? It's because they're thinking of grass as something that you need to get it all in your animal. No, you need to capture every photon. That's your number one job. You change that mindset and everything else falls into place.
Okay. We've got a question here from the audience. What are the most drought resistant things to plant for feed during these extremely dry conditions? So we talked about, making sure that we have green cover on the ground and capturing that moisture and keeping it there. But what is something that's drought resistant?
Sometimes the worst things that we plant are, sorghum. Sorghum will probably do as good a job converting moisture into dry matter as anything. Some of your millets are close behind. But some of the things that we, of course, perennials tend to be more drought tolerant than annuals because they have a readily, fully developed root system. And sometimes it's about not what we plant, but what we don't plant that comes up. Two of the most drought tolerant plants there are Palmer amaranth and kochia. And we spend thousands of dollars every year controlling those two species, and they're just as high in protein as alfalfa and just as productive per inch of moisture as sorghum, or more so. I mean, kochia has incredible water use efficiency. And if sometimes there's an opportunity, I was going through Dodge City one day, or on my way to Dodge City, and I saw a farm there, and it was in 2012. The pasture looked about like the carpet in my office here, just, scalped to the ground. One tractor was hauling hay to the cattle on the pasture. There was wheat stubble right next to the pasture that was full of kochia, Palmer amaranth, crabgrass, all extremely palatable weeds to cattle, and they were spraying it. So they were spending money to spray the weed, spray feed, at the same time they were hauling feed, spending money to haul feed to their cattle. Like, all you need is a hot wire and open that gate, and you've got both those problems solved. And, I'm not advocating letting those species go to seed, but you can get a lot of grazing off of them, spray them later after you've got some feed value off of those, and take advantage of what, sometimes I think weeds are a sign from God that we're not using the sunlight and rainfall that he's given us. And
there you go.
Maybe we need to just change our mindset there.
Okay. All right. So we've had wildfires in this area around this part of the world. And I know you're over in the Flint Hills, and I grew up burning pasture and everything.
Mm-hmm.
How can these principles help us in recovering, whether it's from a wildfire situation or recovering pasture after we do our every other year, or however, every third year or so burn? How can these principles help us out with that? How can we work with those, or should we maybe start thinking about not burning as much?
I think there's still a value to burning. There are some things that a burn does, like, for example, cedar controlling cheatgrass. Those are kind of hard to do inexpensively by any other means. You can spend a fortune on cedar control if you do it mechanically, and a match costs a fraction of a penny. But some things you can do to kind of mimic the effects of a fire is, I talked about using native range as a winter grazing resource. And if you have cattle that are dry, non-lactating, dormant winter range, especially as you go west and get more into buffalo grass country, blue crop, can be a fantastic winter grazing resource. And once you eat it off, and you can manage to, eat that off, or use your fencing to eat the perimeter of your property first, so that you've got a natural fire break that you can help control wildfire. If you don't want wildfire coming onto your place, if you graze the perimeter first, you've removed the fuel load. If you want to do some controlled burning, you can winter graze the perimeter, or whatever unit you want to burn, you can winter graze around it to create a fire barrier.
Okay. Seems like a lot of our problems, or a lot of our challenges, could be fixed with just a hot wire and a little bit of time, right?
Yeah, and people, the main objection to rotational grazing is, I don't have the time. And so, and the analogy I give people is that, okay, how much land do you have? Well, let's just say 1,000 acres. Well, suppose the guy across the road from you came over one day and says, hey, I'm going to retire. Would you like to rent my land? You know, every farmer's going to say yes. He says, oh, well, wait a minute. Don't say yes yet. Said, what if I pay all the inputs? I pay all the inputs and the rent is free. All you got to do is, come over and work it. Are there any farmers that would turn that deal down?
I don't think
so. Well, Jennifer, because they're too dang busy.
Really?
Right. No. They tell me they're too busy to put in an extra 10 minutes a day to move that polywire. But if the neighbor offered to rent them land and paid all the inputs and gave free rent, they would be drooling all over each other. Brothers would be stabbing brothers in the back to get hold of that deal, right?
Yeah.
No, it's going to double their workload, but it'll double their productivity and with no additional expense, right? Well, that's what rotational grazing does. It increases your productivity with no additional expense other than $100 poly reel and poly tape. If you step in post, you can double your productivity with no big out-of-pocket expenses, just 10 minutes a day. You don't have to work twice as hard. You just work an extra 10 minutes a day. And what I've found, and I've seen research to back this up, once you get into rotational grazing, it actually cuts your workload, your daily time commitment per cow about 75%.
Wow.
I know my dad spent more time looking for his cows out on the pasture than I spend moving on polywire. I know where my cows are, well, most of the time. I just don't know which neighbor they're at, so.
They're just on walkabout. Let's see here. Remember, folks, if you've got questions, go ahead and type them in here. We do have a comment from Yvonne. She said, the Anderson fire in Barber and Comanche counties, we continue to have range management specialists and a live research lab. So we're learning how wildfires affect our native range. I go back to yesterday. We had Dustin Aaron who came on, and we talked about cow size and profitability on our pastures. Can we talk about what's a good size cow in this situation? And I know it depends on everybody's, what their profits are and what their I mean, that's kind of like
trying to slap a bullseye on me, aren't you? I want to get nasty emails from all the cattle breeders. I play journal reading area here, so I think we are finding out that I think the ideal cow size, in the 60s, we had this big push, 60s, 70s, we had a big push towards exotics because bigger was better. And we found out those exotics took more winter feed. They were higher input demanding cattle. Well, when inputs are cheap, that's okay. When like I said, when diesel's 15 cents a gallon and balers you can make hay cheap, ridiculously cheap in the 60s and 70s, why not have high input cattle? But today that's no longer the case. Those inputs are expensive. And so if moving to a smaller frame animal makes more economic sense, and honestly, I think it does under our current economic conditions. Now, don't make the mistake though that just go smaller and you'll be fine. Because there are small animals that just simply won't, they're small because they just won't grow. You still need animals that will grow, but they might be earlier maturing animals that they'll grow fast, but they top out at their peak size. And those animals tend to convert better than the larger animals that are extremely heavy milking. If you're having to catch cows and milk them out because the calf just can't latch on, that's a sign that you got animals that are too productive, I guess. And that's kind of an oxymoron, too productive. But you've outdone your environment and your level of management. We don't need dairy animals. in a beef operation. So, and I've probably said just enough on that topic to get me in a lot of hot water with a lot of people.
Well, that's okay. All right. So one of the things that you said in your presentation that really struck out with me, or struck my mind, was we could get 5 times the stocking rate if you go to
I said that guy was doing that. I'm not recommending that you do. If you go to rotational grazing, stick with the stocking rate you've got and gradually increase it. When you see productivity increases, it's always better to have more grass than cattle than the other way around. So start the system, keep your stocking rate the same, and then just adjust from there. And usually it's more profitable to increase the length of the grazing season than to increase your number of animals.
Okay.
Because if you're losing money on every head, more head doesn't help you. But if you can reduce your cost per animal by grazing longer, then each animal becomes more profitable. I'd rather make $10 a head on 100 head than lose $10 a head on 1,000 head. That's a lot better situation. So if you change the expense side of the equation dramatically for longer grazing season, then that will impact your profitability a lot more than adding more animals.
Okay. Well, folks, it doesn't look like I've got any more questions, and we're coming up at the top of the hour. So I want to thank our speakers for today. Thank you all for joining us as well. Thank you to Rebecca and to Dale, and thanks to our sponsors, Ward Labs Incorporated. Remember, you can join us right here at this very same link at noon when we feature ag law and tax expert Roger McEwen. He's going to help us consider how we will transition the ranching operation to the next generation. And Logan Hoffman, he will help us reconsider our methods of record keeping and accounting for better ranch management. It's a seminar for the whole family business, so you might want to bring some of your employees and family members to the screen to watch that session too. It's great lunchtime conversation. The next session, like I said, it begins right here at this very same link at noon. Grab a lunch and join us for some learning. By the way, if you like this format or if there's something different we can do, please let us know. All of our registered attendees will receive a survey in their email boxes. As you might imagine, we're reinventing our programming right now, and we could really use your feedback to make sure that we craft session topics and times and all of this that help you. So thank you for filling those out and helping us make a better experience for all of our participants in the future. On behalf of all of us here at High Plains Journal, thanks for riding with us this morning, and we'll see you right here at noon for our next session of High Plains Journal's virtual Cattle U.
Dirt road in a gooseneck, saddle up with me. Dry land in God's country, crops far as I can see. Headlights on both ends of my day.